I'm a home builder's son, and so that's how I got interested in architecture. Pasadena Heritage, LA Conservancy, both sort of focus on the built environment, but also get into history and culture. I got involved maybe about 7 years ago with both organizations. And one of the challenges we have in developing cultural programming here in Southern California is the fact that we have 4 major communities in Pasadena, and 3 of them, African American, Asian American, and Latino, actually comprise about 60%, 2% of our population right now. And so what we're always trying to do is reach out and discover stories that are meaningful to those communities and figure out how to tell them. And that's really how this series developed. It was really Kathy Haney's idea to say, hey, can we develop programming for Black History Month, Asia Pacific Islander Month in May, and then Hispanic Heritage Month in September, October. So we did the API Month presentation last May, and then Hispanic influence on California architecture last November. So obviously that left Black History Month. But it was a little bit challenging because Black history is a thing, it's a field. I have not studied it, and so that was a little bit of a high barrier. But at the same time, if you're going to do these other 2 groups, you really can't not do African American history as well. So was looking for what would be a good way to focus on this. And so the answer turned out to be when I was doing a tour for Pasadena Heritage, we were talking about the Civic Center. And we were going over the bus of the Robinson brothers that are across from the Civic Center. And I was trying to figure out how to talk to people about Frank Robinson, that he was an Olympian, et cetera. And I was not getting across. And then I realized that a lot of people did not know who Jackie Robinson was. And I asked for a show of hands, and about 40% of the people did not know who Jackie Robinson was, although arguably a century later, he may be the most influential person ever to have been raised in Pasadena. And I saw that as an opportunity to take some of these stories that some of us know and repackage them in a way that they might be significant for an audience here in Pasadena. All 3 of these presentations were focused on Pasadena. And that's how we came up with these particular stories. And this is not a Black history. We're not trying to talk about the history of the community either in Pasadena or in Los Angeles, but rather it's the story of about a half dozen individuals who had enormous impact, and not just on the Black community, but on a lot of what makes Southern California what it is today, and on American history. So I knew John Hope Franklin, the great historian, when I was at the University of Chicago. And he wrote literally the book for generations on Black history, from slavery to freedom, which was published in 1947, has been, for generations, it was the most likely text, and sold 3 million copies at this point in time, which for a 700-page history book is kind of unbelievable. And his viewpoint was very strongly that on Black history, which he helped sort of define as a field, you have to bore down in regard to the individuals in the community story, but constantly keep that within the larger context of how it fits into American history. So we're going to be talking about half a dozen Black individuals, but within the context of how they affected what LA is today. So let's start at the beginning. Mission San Gabriel was founded in 1769. In 1781, the Pueblo of Los Angeles was founded, and over half of the 44 original settlers had some African blood. How many people knew that? I didn't know that until I started studying this. And a Black friend of mine who's a docent at LA Conservancy really got me interested in 5 years ago when we had done a tour together, and we were talking afterwards. He said, "Oh, did you know that over half of the original settlers were black?" And I said, "Oh, that's very interesting, Stephen." And I was thinking, he's tripping. I mean, this can't be true, 1781? But I went back and looked it up on Google, and turns out that was the case. And they were recruited from northern Mexico. To my knowledge, they were here they were free men and all here of their own volition. And they were taking a chance for a better future out on the frontier. Only 3 of the 44 apparently were what we would now classify as white or entirely of European origin. And here is a representation, obviously a painting from a later point in time, of the original 1781 Pobladores. I'm not sure, how does it, actually can you read that? Does that read at the back of the room? Okay. So one of the interesting things is at one point there were more people of African ancestry in Mexico than there were in the US. And Mexico got its independence in 1821 as part of a liberalizing movement, and they eliminated slavery in 1829, a good deal faster than we did here in the US. We know that 26 of the 44 1781 settlers were of African descent because the Spanish had what was called a casta system, where in the US historically people have been identified with one particular group. The Spanish looked at combinations. So mulatto, which was the majority of the people from 1781, was of combined African and European ancestry. Mestizo was combined European and Amerindian ancestry. When Mexico, modern Mexico, got its independence and was forming an identity in the 1910s, they very consciously tried to identify the identity of the nation as being mestizo, or mixed, European and Amerindian. And maybe a little bit analogous to our concept of the melting pot here in the US. But over time, once again, there had been a very substantial African population in Mexico. Over time, the Mexican government recognized African strain as the third cultural strain in the country, in Mexico's development, and that was officially recognized in 1992. And throughout Latin America, the way they think about ethnicity is a little bit different than historically we have in the US. So for example, in Portuguese, there's a term pardo, or pardo, which means any sort of mixed ancestry of African, European, and Amerindian. And at census time, over 40% of Brazilians identify themselves as pardo or mixed. So it's a different way than we tend to think about it here. I did not know that until Stephen told me that five or so years ago. And that was one of the reasons that I got interested in this, because finding out that Black history started so much earlier here in Southern California than I had a sense of it. This is not a picture of the 1781 Pobladores. It's taken a little bit later, since photography was not invented until the 1840s. This is probably 1850s to 1870s. And you can see that people are really getting into, there's a fair amount of swagger here, and people are really getting into the Western cowboy look here. I like this photo a lot. You think about 19th century posed photos, everybody looks like they've been embalmed. These people look like they're having fun, don't they? And then Pio Pico. Pio Pico was the last Mexican governor of Alta California, as California was called then. And he was of multiracial background. How many people knew that? See, I didn't know that, once again, until I started working on this. So his grandparents were he was born here. He is a Pasadena adjacent boy. born at the Mission San Gabriel in 1798. His father was with the military in Spain and served at a number of the missions. And his grandparents were of mixed mulatto, European, African, and then mestizo, European, Amerindian ancestry. It's interesting that he ended up being the last governor of the state. This was one of the most important roles of anyone in California during the time that Mexico had it, in that he was responsible for the transition to U.S. ownership, which could have gone very badly. And it went quite smoothly. And he was a charismatic guy. He had actually first become governor of California in 1832, and then again in 1946. He had a great ability to make relationship bridge gaps, as shown by the fact that in 1856, he organized the California Republican Party convention. Now, the Republican Party, you may recall at that point, was the anti-slavery party, and he himself was, not surprisingly, anti-slavery. But here's a guy who was, in 1846, he is running the armed defense against U.S. invasion for the Mexican government. And a decade later, he is sponsoring a major American political party convention. That's kind of a rare set of social skills. And I think also it's a case where he also may have had some opportunities by virtue of being on the frontier that he would not have had if he was in Mexico City or certainly in Spain. This is a picture of picture of Pio and his family. I'd always thought he was a little unusual looking, but I never thought he was black until someone said he was black, and then it seemed obvious. After the conversion to the U.S., he became a vast landowner and one of the richest Southern Californians. And the rancheros, the people who had land holdings under the under the Mexican government, relatively few of them were able to make the transition and be successful in the American cash economy. Pico was one of those people. He built the Pico house in the 1860s. It's still up. I'm sure we've all seen it. It's right across from Olivera Street. It's done in an Italianate style. It was a very lavish hotel, the most luxurious in Southern California, and in fact, the first three-story building in LA. He had difficulties in his last year. He actually lived until 93. He died in the 1890s, although he was governor in 1846. And he got into a bad habit of litigation, so that he was in generally land litigation for almost the last 30 years of his life. And at one point, he had 3 cases in front of the California Supreme Court at the same time. So eventually that gets expensive. When you go to trial, obviously you're rolling the dice, and eventually they didn't come up for him, and he was in reduced circumstances very late in his life. But really sort of a remarkable story, and seeing this, we get found in 1781, he dies in 1893. Throughout this first century, enormous amount of African influence from the Mexican side. And then here's Pio late in life, when he was having some circumstances, but you can still see this enormous dignity here. He actually reminds me in this portrait a little bit of U.S. Grant. Now we get to Biddy Mason. I imagine most people has anyone not heard of Biddy Mason here? Okay. So Biddy Mason was born a slave in either Georgia or Mississippi in 1818. At some point, She was either given to or sold to the Smith family in Mississippi. They became Mormon and went west to Utah and then to California. Biddy, who'd had a number of children during this time period, came along. She, in fact, walked from Mississippi to Utah, which is 2,000 miles or so, and I think a good deal of the way to California as well. And the Smiths moved to California in 1851, and in fact, there had been a significant Mormon influx in the early 1850s. I believe the town of Riverside was in large measure settled by Mormons. Now, California became a state in 1850, and it came as a free, it joined the Union as a free state. So when I first heard about Biddy Mason, I'd say, why would a slaveholder bring a slave to a free state? But in fact, in the early 1850s, it was really ambiguous as to what the status of slaves was. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which allowed repatriation of slaves from a free state to their owners in a slave state, and sometimes people who were free people ended up being mistaken for slaves and essentially moved into slavery because of that. It turns out there was a lot of ambiguity, and as shown by the fact that Biddy was in the Smith household for a number of years. At some point, Smith decided he was going to leave, go back to Texas, which was a slave state at the time. As he was in the process of leaving, a sheriff came and stopped them from leaving. And it's ambiguous to this point as to exactly how that happened, whether, in fact, it was abolitionists or free black men who knew the family, one of whom eventually married one of Biddy's daughters. Anyway, it ended up in court. And the judge, who was a very successful young politician at the time, ended up more or less circumventing California law to make the decision on the case, because at that time, blacks were not allowed to testify in court. So the issue is, did Biddy want to leave, or did she not want to leave? Did she know what was involved in this or not? So he took her into chambers to get her testimony. And he ended up deciding for, essentially, not to keep her in California, but to allow her to decide to stay in California. One of the reasons being that she had children. And while the status of someone who came to the state as a slave might be ambiguous, anyone who was born in California at that time apparently would be free. So if she was going to go to Texas and she had some affection for the family, she would have had to leave her children here in California. So that was the deciding factor for her. She achieved freedom in this 1856 court case. And this ambiguity in California law, partly because of the fact that the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, was dominated by justices from the South, was essentially resolved by that. And that one case more or less cleared up the status of California as a free state in fact as well as in law. She was trained as a midwife. She had a mixed black-white clientele. She was very good at her job, apparently had an incredible constitution, worked more hours than an ATM, and was just always about town. And being a midwife at that point, has anyone seen Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman? You know, you're out on the frontier. There are a lot of things that would be done by doctors in Philadelphia that would be done by midwives in the West, whether white or black. And so she thrived in that role. She turned out to be a great investor. And she achieved her freedom in 1856. A decade later, she bought her first property. And by 1870, she had 3 or 4 properties. And does everybody know where the Bradbury building is downtown, right across from Grand Central Market. She apparently owned most of that block by the early 1870s. And it's kind of remarkable because by all accounts, she was not literate when she attained her freedom in 1856. So she was not just, she was really one of the most successful self-made women real estate investors in early LA, and one of the most successful black investors, either male or female. She also was a tremendous philanthropist. The first AME church was founded in her first African Methodist Episcopal church was founded in her living room in 1872. It's now a mega congregation with about 19,000 parishioners, including somebody we're going to be talking about later in the presentation. And during the 1870s, there were some financial crises in the black community, and she essentially went to the local grocers and said, if people in the community can't pay, put it on my tab. I will float them until, float for their account until they're in a position to repay, which eventually everybody did. There is a park, Biddy Mason Park. How many people have been to Biddy Mason Park? So if you go out the east side of Grand Central Market, just south of the Bradbury Building, there is this park which has about a 100-foot mural which goes into the story I've just told much better than I did. And it also has reproductions of her certificate of freedom and her first real estate deed, et cetera. It's very interesting, sort of intimate. But it's behind the first wall of buildings, so you have to look around a little bit to find the entrance. The street address is 333 South Spring Street, and you can also Google Biddy Mason Park, LA, online. And her most famous quote is, "If you hold your hand closed, nothing good can come in. The open hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance even as it receives." This is a picture of her house, in which the first AME church was founded in 1872. Oops. And the next, we're going to jump forward a little bit at this point to Paul R. Williams, one of the early great LA architects. How many people have heard of Paul R. Williams? Okay, almost everybody. So he grew up in an orphanage. He then went to Poly High School, not ours here in Pasadena, but one in Los Angeles, which is now apparently out in the valley. And at the time, it was one of the 2 or 3 best high schools in LA. In his first grade class, he was the only African American in his class. And then he went to USC. Do we have any Trojans here? No. Oh, okay. And of course, USC then as now was one of the outstanding private universities on the West Coast. And it also had a lot of classmates of the sort that would eventually make good clients for him because they were from upper middle class families. When he was in high school, his guidance counselor at Poly suggested he not become an architect. He'd already decided that's what he wanted to do. And he said, "Who ever heard of a Negro architect?" And that sort of redoubled Paul's interest in this line of work. And he later said, "If there weren't any, then I thought there was room for at least one." He became the first licensed black architect west of the Mississippi. Yeah, he didn't open a solo practice in 1921. He ended up getting his license in 1921 and opening a solo office a few years later. He worked for a while earlier for a number of architects, including Roland Johnson, who was active in Pasadena at that point. And he said he learned from Johnson how to deal with a $100,000 house, although he'd never been in any house worth more than $10,000 until that point in time. And he got a reputation as architect to the stars, but he also did a lot of public housing. He had a very, very broad practice. And he was a guy, well, let's take a look at him. This is not a great reproduction, but it's such a great picture. Would you want to buy a house from a guy who looked like that? I would. Here's a little bit later, but also a slightly better image. You can sort of get a sense of the sort of charisma and presence and gravitas he had, even these very early photographs. And one of his major commissions was the first AME church in Los Angeles that Biddy Mason had formed in her living room about 40, 50 years before. And he was a lifelong parishioner of that church. He also, I think one of the points that we're trying to make in this presentation is not just how these individuals had a big impact on Black life, but on life generally in Los Angeles. One of the things with Paul R. Williams, very low-key guy, but he defined a lot of what we think of as classic LA style in the 20s and 30s. So he did the Beverly Hills Hotel, the Polo Lounge, etc. He did Saks Fifth Avenue. He did Perino's, which in its day was something like the Polo Lounge or the Copa or Musso and Frank's. Really very central things, aspects of LA. This is maybe his most famous celebrity client was Frank Sinatra. This is a picture of him and his daughter, who was an interior designer, working with Sinatra in regard to his house. And I'm a builder's son, and so one of the things I was really interested in was how did he get so much work? Because what the guidance counselor was getting at, to a certain extent, was in 1900, only 3% of LA was African American. So you had a relatively small potential client pool. And throughout his career, the 80% plus of his commissions were coming from white clients. So how did he do that? Well, first of all, he had grown up in a situation where the normative environments he was in were white, where he was a small minority and he had to understand what the rules of that game were very well. I think of it in some ways a little bit like Barack Obama, for example, who did not really grow up in American black environment until his late teens when he came to the mainland. So you have to observe more under those circumstances. The other thing is his education. Remember, he'd gone to one of the best high schools and one of the best colleges available at a time when only about 4% of Americans had graduated from college. So he, in fact, was more educated than the vast majority of his clients, even if they might have been more wealthy. One of the reasons that we don't know more about Paul R. Williams is there isn't a Paul R. Williams style. He would do Spanish Colonial Revival, Art Deco, Mediterranean, Norman. What he was looking to do was understand what the client's needs were, and then to build in that style. He wasn't trying to build a Paul R. Williams house. And he learned a lot of things to do. One was, the most famous, perhaps, is drawing upside down. He was a great sketcher. He learned how to do this upside down because of a concern that some clients might not be comfortable sitting next to a black man. So maybe the best upside down delineator in at least American architectural history. Another thing he would do is, apparently, because he had a lot of buildings out there, people would come in because they'd seen a building, they'd heard his name, they did not realize he was black. And then they'd get in and they'd be, in some cases, uncomfortable and be looking to get out the door or whatever. And he would say, oh, well, I understand this isn't a match for you. Normally I just do houses of $10,000 or more. That wasn't true. That was a lot of money then. But he said, maybe, let's talk about it. Maybe I can give you a couple of ideas for your next architect. And then, of course, bring them in and get a better understanding and establish a relationship. He also was in a position where he, as I said, was able to understand the client's needs. One of the things he said was conservative styles work better because they're going to last longer and they're a better investment, which is probably true, but it's not the way you make a name for yourself as a famous architect. He also said that one of the keys for him in regard to success as an architect was learning when to quit. He said most people do not know what they want, and the architect's job is to help them figure that out and then get it done in a tasteful style, and then leave it alone. Know when to walk away. There are not a lot of famous architects where that is their philosophy. And he designed 3,000 structures. Now, let's put that in perspective for a second. Here in Pasadena, of course, we're very high on the Green Brothers, Green and Green. They had a total output of, I think, 180 projects, somewhere around there. Paul R. Williams, in some ways, is comparable to Julia Morgan, the first certified, accredited female architect in the West. And she had a great long career. We have the YWCA, which hopefully we're going to get restored here in the Civic Center. And she did about 700 buildings over her career. Frank Lloyd Wright, who had a 70-year career, did about 900 buildings. And Williams ended up with 3,000 buildings. I mean, that is a lot of buildings. And he did not get those buildings because he was a black architect. He got those buildings because he was a great home builder in terms of understanding his client's needs, and then being able to fulfill those. And I think that he said that earlier in his career, without question, it was a disadvantage being African American. Later on, in the 50s and 60s, once he had some clients like Frank Sinatra, it maybe was a little bit of a plus because of being, as he put it, exotic. But there's no question that most of those 3,000 buildings that he got built were overcoming some obstacles by virtue of being African American. And it took a while, once again, because he was a quiet guy, for him to get his due. But he's been hot the last 5 years. So he was given the gold medal posthumously by the AIA, American Institute of Architects. He was the first African American recipient of that award. And he also was accredited as one of the most distinguished alumni of both USC and particularly the USC Architecture School in the last 5 years or so. And his daughter, I think it's his granddaughter, does some talks in regard to her. Somebody knows her name, and maybe in the Q&A we can mention it, because that could be quite interesting. So let's look at some of his stuff. This is, I think, Patty, you described this as almost like a mid-century modern prairie-style combination, very nicely proportioned. This is one of the more elaborate Spanish colonial revival style houses. He was one of the architects. As I said, he did a lot of styles, but some of the stuff that he did, early stuff in Spanish colonial revival style, were some of the defining buildings of that sort. Other thing is that although he lived in South Central for 30 years and then moved to Lafayette Park and built his own home, which is celebrated. But his initial business, a lot of it was in the Pasadena, Flint Ridge area. His first commission before he opened, big commission, was in Flint Ridge. That gave him the money to be able to open his office, so he definitely has a connection here. Other thing, I didn't think of it earlier, one of Biddy Mason's daughters married one of the very early black Pasadena settlers, even 20 years, who was here 20 years before Pasadena became a town in the 1870s. And here's some more. and not a good likeness, but this is one of his Palm Springs commissions. Here you can see this is modern, very, very different than the other houses that we've seen. Remember, he started his practice in the 20s when Mediterranean Spanish colonial revival and Art Deco were waxing. Anyone recognize this building? This is the theme restaurant at LAX. It was done in 1962. There were a number of architects involved. He was not design architect for it, but he was one of the architects who was responsible for the airport as a whole when it was built out to roughly its current proportions. And this is rather different than anything else. And it's also, for a lot of people who first come to LA, Paul R. Williams has created the gate to the city. Because when you walk out of LAX, this is the first thing you're going to see from any part of the terminal. So now to Jackie Robinson and some of the inspiration for this talk, and finding out that there were a bunch of people who did not know about Jackie Robinson. And he was raised in Pasadena. His mother did various sorts of odd jobs, but was able to acquire enough money to purchase a home for Jackie and his siblings. Here is a picture of the family early on. And of course, he was, I guess without question, the most successful school athlete in Pasadena history. He was a sports star for John Muir High School. So here's Muir. And here is the baseball team at Muir. And then he moved on to PCC. And here he is on the basketball team at PCC. And then he moved on to UCLA. And do we have any Bruins here? Okay. And UCLA then was one of the great public universities on the West Coast. And he was a four-sport star at UCLA. He was best known as a two-time All-American in football on some very good UCLA teams, one of which I think was undefeated. He also set a national record and got an NCAA championship in the broad jump. And I used to play basketball. I cannot figure out this photo. Is the photographer in a pit or something? I mean, that is some serious hops. And then he played baseball. And you know what? That was his worst sport. No, seriously, that was his worst sport in college. Oops. So what we're going to do now is talk a little, before we finish about the most famous parts of Jackie's career, we're going to talk a little bit about his brother, Mack. Mack's older brother, who is the other face on the bust in front of City Hall, a little bit to the south of here, was also a great athlete who preceded him at Muir and then at PCC, and he set some national records, junior college records at PCC in both the 100, 220, and broad jump. I think the broad jump record was later broken by Jackie. And then he ended up silver medalist at the 36 Olympics in 200 meter race behind Jesse Owens. Everybody know about that race? Okay. So this was a really huge thing. And at least from my perspective, it's maybe misperceived a little bit. And to understand the importance of the 36 Olympics, you got to sort of go back a couple of months. And, here's Mack. I didn't give Mack his due here. He looks pretty intense, doesn't he? I mean, this is not a guy I want to line up against, to run against in track and field. But to talk about the 36 Olympics, we have to talk about the Joe Louis Max Schmeling fight. And Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, was probably the first great black athletic superstar because of radio. Boxing was a much bigger deal then than it is now. People would listen to the fights. He had sort of a combination of Ali's size and the young Mike Tyson's power. And there was a saying that you didn't want to go to get a beer during a fight because it would be over by the time you got back. And he literally did have a lot of first-round knockouts. So in 1936, he had a 27-0 record. He was widely seen as the best boxer in the world. There was a European champion, a German named Max Schmeling, a smart guy who saw one weakness in Lewis, where after a certain type of punch, he would be vulnerable for a second. Nobody else had either noticed it or had been able to react to it. Schmeling based his fight plan on that, and in fact, he knocked out Joe Louis. And it was the first time Louis had been knocked down. Now, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, and of course, a big part of Nazi ideology was Aryan superiority. So one of the things the Nazis were extremely good at was as propaganda. In fact, the modern term basically comes from that. So they got a lot of mileage about Schmeling defeating Louis as being evidence of the superiority of the white race. So then 2 months later in Berlin, you have the Olympics. And Jesse Owens had the first sweep in Olympic history where he won gold medals in 4 separate events. And then in the 200, Mack Robinson ended up in second place. So you can see where he is. And Jesse did pretty well in that race. And interestingly enough, Mack broke the Olympic record, but still lost the race. And so sometimes when people are talking about Mack, they sort of say, oh, well, he was a great athlete, just happened to come up at the wrong time. It's like being Karl Malone when Michael Jordan was playing or something like that. But in fact, his success and other black athletes was really important because that sort of punctured the balloon in regard to Nazi ideology on Aryan superiority. If it had just been one guy, one fabulous athlete, it wouldn't have been as strong a case. So the fact that you had both of these African Americans on the podium in Berlin was something that was really important. And it's hard to realize today, but as I said, these two events, the Lewis Schmeling fight and the Olympics, were huge stories at the time. When I think of American Olympic history and events that really were political caught, that zeitgeist, there are really 3 that come to mind. This, the 36 Berlin Olympics, with African Americans on the podium, and Jesse Owens, the 68 Black Power salute in Mexico, and then the Miracle on Ice, Lake Placid win versus the Soviet Union in hockey in 1980. It was really a very important moment, and it's interesting that you have these 2 brothers from one family here in Pasadena who took part in 2 of the most important sports events in the 20th century. This is Mack later in life. He spent 2 years at the University of Oregon, came back to help support the family, worked in a variety of jobs with the city of Pasadena for a long period of time, and was very active in serving the community, particularly in regard to reducing street crime. Throughout his life, he ended up passing in the year 2000. And in the early 80s, he was lobbying to get a statue of his brother at UCLA Stadium, which is now, I think, Jackie Robinson. So UCLA, for whatever reason, was not ponying up the money, so he got a private subscription in order to get this. So this is a picture of him late in life looking at this picture of his brother, which he got the money to deal with. So we're talking about, okay, we're back to Jackie. This presentation has changed a lot. So during the war, he was inducted. He went to officer training school, and he then landed with the Black Panthers, 761st Armored Battalion. How many people have heard of the Black Panthers? So this is like the Tuskegee Airmen, except in tanks. It was an all-black unit, and it was seen as an experiment. And it would be, before I talk about this, I'll talk about his experience there. He ended up in with a crisis where he was going back to the base on a bus, and the driver told him to move to the back of the bus. Now, it was a civilian driver, but a military bus. It so happened that the Army had desegregated transportation a couple of months before that. So the driver had no authority to tell him to move to the back of the bus. But he did it anyway, and Jackie said he wasn't going to do it, and the driver apparently used some unfortunate language, and Lieutenant Robinson said he was going to jack the driver up if he did that again. That's my words, not Lieutenant Robinson's. He used apparently somewhat stronger language. So eventually they get a captain, and they're trying to sort this out, and the captain thought that Lieutenant Robinson had a very bad attitude for a U.S. military officer being asked illegally to move to the back of the bus. And he wanted to court-martial Jackie. It went up to the 7061st commander, who said, this is ridiculous, you want to rethink this. The guy wouldn't. The commander said, I'm not going to pursue this. Both officers, Jackie and then the MP, were transferred to another unit where the court-martial went forward. And eventually the judges, the military tribunal, found 9-0, that he was innocent. And at that point, he wasn't really happy with the Army. The Army wasn't happy with him, and so he ended up getting out. But getting an honorable discharge was really important, because if things had gone the other way, it might have been hard politically for Branch Rickey to bring him in. But back to the Black Panthers division. First of all, Black Panthers is such a great name. You think, well, obviously it's been there forever, but what? That's a weird name. And the reason for that is in German, armored or tank is Panzer. And they also had one of their best tanks was called a Panther tank. And Panther, the cat, is the same word in both German and English. So the guys in the 61st said, hey, we're the Black Panzers, the Black Panthers. And I mean, now, 70 years later, it's hard to imagine a day where that term didn't exist, because it's been used so many times since then. Anyway, they shipped abroad, like the Tuskegee Airmen. There was not, initially, there was a hesitance in regard to putting them into combat. And they were concerned that they were just going to stay stateside for the entire war. And they did eventually get put into the line in the fall of 1944, and then fought consistently for 6 months, which is a very long time for a combat unit to be in the line through 6 countries, and eventually met the Soviet forces in Austria. And they got a distinguished unit citation, although it took a while to do that. And their unit slogan was "Come Out Fighting," which was from Joe Louis when he was asked how he was going to deal with the rematch with Schmeling. He said, I'm going to come out fighting. And these guys clearly had something to prove, and they did, as the Tuskegee Airmen did. And Harry Truman then desegregated the Army in 1948, and that was a really, 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 really big thing, because 16 million Americans had served in the armed forces in World War II. We just won the war. The armed forces were perhaps at their highest prestige. And if you were going to take the largest American institution and desegregate it, it was hard to argue that you would not do that in other parts of American life. And of course, 7 years later, you had the Birmingham bus boycott. The Dunsley Abernathy was here earlier today. How many people were here for that? Yeah, I mean, I was old enough to have followed that, story, and I reread her book last night. The images that she was showing is really chilling. Some of those, you instantly recognize those images after 50 years when you see them again. Well worth seeing if you have an opportunity to hear her at some future point. But that was a really, really important thing. And you really don't know. But if the airmen and the 761st had not fought well, maybe there wouldn't have been as much enthusiasm about that. Maybe it would have come a little later. So here's their emblem. I think without question one of the better emblem slogan signs I've seen. And here some of the soldiers in action. And then the airmen, who were often, the planes were often called red tail because of the markings on their tail. And one of the big moments of the State of the Union address a couple of months ago was when Charles McGee, who was, I believe, the last surviving Tuskegee airman, had been promoted to brigadier general earlier in the day and was recognized at the State of the Union. It's hard to believe this guy's 101 years old. I mean, I would be quite happy to look this way at 82. And the thing with his record, I'd heard of him a little bit over the years, but didn't have a firm image. He flew 439 combat missions in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. That's more than any other U.S. flyer who served in all three of those wars. And to put that in perspective, the bombers that were making runs over Germany were rotated out of the line after 25 successful missions. And plus, he's flying combat missions well into his mid-late 40s. Combat is usually a young man's game. You don't see, and obviously he chose to do that. He wasn't going to be assigned that. So Jackie comes back, and he then ends up in the Negro Leagues. And he plays one season, 52 games with the Kansas City Monarchs. And then he's recruited by the Dodgers in 1946, which we'll talk about later. One of the things that was interesting to me was that we tend to see Jackie Robinson as a saint at this point in time, and he had some issues, but the thing that was really interesting to me is there were other players in the Negro League who were pissed that he came first because he said he's not the best player, which apparently there was general agreement he wasn't. And there were other people like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige who'd paid their dues. And there were young players like Larry Doby and Monty Irvin, who as a young player, you might make a case that would be as good or better. And remember, number one, baseball was his worst sport in college. And number two, he'd played very little baseball for 5 years. So here you have this guy, and this incidentally is Larry Doby, who integrated the American leagues only 12 weeks after Jackie came up with the Dodgers in the National League. And he went on to a Hall of Fame career, actually had much better numbers in terms of home runs and RBIs than Jackie Robinson did, although he came into the league younger. And here's Satchel Paige, universally seen as the best showman in the Negro Leagues and probably in baseball during his time period. You can see that personality there. I mean, he was famous for a lot of sayings. He became a rookie at the age of 42, oldest rookie in Major League history at that point. And he was asked about his age a lot. And he said, it's a question of mind and matter. If you don't mind, it don't matter. And he was also famous for don't look back, it might be gaining on you. And the next year, he came up with the Giants, also in New York in '48. And the next year was the first black pitcher, I believe, in the World Series. Now we get back to Mr. Robinson. and this is, how many people know the story of Branch Rickey, and how many people don't know that story on how he was recruited? Okay, so brief story. We started a little late, so I'm going to try and compress the tail end of this a little bit. Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Dodgers, New York Dodgers at that point, had been looking for some period of time for a black player to break the color line. And it was consistent with his values, but it also, from his perspective, was good business. There was a very large black population in Brooklyn then and now. So he's looking for the right player and scouting around, and Jackie Robinson was very attractive to him for a number of reasons. Number one, he had started out playing on largely white teams from childhood, so there was no question that he would be able to function successfully in that kind of environment. Secondly, he was a college graduate. Third, he'd been a U.S. military officer. All of these were big pluses, but at the same time, it was known this court-martial that he had. So Rickey brought him into New York, to Brooklyn, and had a conversation. Jackie Robinson thought that they were maybe going to start another Negro League. That's what he's being recruited for. And Rickey was saying, well, no, I want you to come into the Dodger organization first year in the minor leagues in Toronto, if you can make that team, and then with the Dodgers the next year, if you can make that team as well. But you're going to get a lot of trouble, a lot of abuse, and we need someone who can stand up to that. And then he went through some role playing in terms of bad stuff that was likely to, and did happen in Jackie's first year. And at one point, Jackie bridled and said, do you want someone who doesn't have enough guts to respond to that? And Rickey said, no, I need someone who has enough guts not to respond. And Robinson thought about it. Obviously, very, very strong character, proud guy, agreed to do it, understood it. He started in 47, and the Dodgers ended up winning the pennant that year. And before he came to the clubhouse, there were some players who were not super comfortable about this. Leo DeRocher, who was the manager at the time, said, look, I don't care if the guy's yellow, black, or striped like a zebra. If he can help us win, I'm going to play him. And Jackie is going to help us win, and he's going to make us rich. And if you don't need the money, Branch Rickey will find some other team that you can play with. And so there was no question of carping after that. And he very quickly established himself. And he had a pretty good career. He was Rookie of the Year in 1947. He was the National League MVP in 49. They had different MVPs for each league. His 1949 contract was the highest ever paid to a Dodger at that point. And it turns out they were right. The Dodgers set major league records for attendance that year and the next year, despite the fact that the Dodger ballpark was like 60% the size of the Yankee ballpark. So, I mean, they were a huge draw, maybe the biggest draw since Babe Ruth on the road. So he did a lot in terms of business. Remember that he enters the major leagues at the age of 28, which is quite advanced for it. So he only plays 10 years. He's Rookie of the Year in 1947. Despite not having played much the prior 5 years, he becomes the MVP in 49. And like I said, he hadn't played much. He actually, after his first year, he got a batting coach who was quite experienced, and he raised his batting average 50 points from about 290 to 340 his second year. That doesn't happen to a 30-year-old player. I mean, it just showed that he was getting by on incredible athleticism and strength of character. Plus, the thing that was most distinctive about him was base running. He was stealing bases in a way that no one had before, and he also the threat of him stealing totally discombobulated the opposing pitchers because of the fact they'd never had to deal with having to worry every time he was on base about him stealing a base. And he was in 5 World Series, winning in 54, I think, 6-time All-Star. And once again, this is someone who starts at age 28. Really quite remarkable career. And here's my favorite action photo of Jackie Robinson. Does anybody know what this play is? He's stealing home against Hall of Fame Yankee catcher Yogi Berra in the, I think, 1953 World Series. And what's great about it is the cap coming off. And virtually no one had ever stolen home before. And to do in the World Series, really quite remarkable. He did it, I think, 19 times in his career, which was maybe the prior record had been 8. And to do it on this stage was quite remarkable. Yogi, of course, was also famous, as Satchel Paige was, for his yogiisms like, it ain't over until it's over. Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore, it's too crowded. Baseball's 90% mental and the other half's physical, stuff like that. And Berra admired Robinson, but whenever he came up, he never forgot this play. He thought he was out. And he, whenever Robinson's name came up, he'd say, great player, and he was out on that play. He never really quite got over it. This is a picture of the Robinson family later in life. And after he retired in 1958, he went on to become the first African-American to be an officer of a major American corporation. He was very active in civil rights. He had a newspaper column after he retired for some period of time. And, it's hard to say, but you could argue that he was as well known as any African-American civil rights symbol prior to the mid-50s in Birmingham and Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, et cetera. And he was, this was not something he chose. It was something, my read on his life is he graduates from college, he's an unbelievable athlete, and then he spends 5 years he played some semi-pro ball, and he was an athletic director. He was this incredible athlete and person who wasn't able to find the right place. And then history found him, and he ended up being the right guy in the right place at the right time. And sadly, he died of diabetes at, I think, 53. Oh, we didn't talk a lot, let's go back. We didn't talk a lot about, Pasadena specifically, places, but we will mention one thing. And everybody recognize this building? This is where Barack Obama lived when he was a student at Oxy. And it's on, I think, Fremont. I'm sorry? Okay, we will find out where that is. Actually, I think it says this. 253 East Glen Arms. See, I'm trying to pay attention to the audience, not them. So let's go to summary. As I said, what we're trying to do here is all of these people have an association with Pasadena. The Pobladores, yeah, it's LA, but if they didn't stop there, who knows? LA might be in Bakersfield now, I mean, not that Bakersfield is not great, but would we rather have Pasadena in Bakersfield or here? I would prefer it here. And then Pio Pico really managed that transition from Mexico to the US, which went pretty seamlessly. In a lot of cases, you may end where you have that sort of territory transfer, you could end up with quite a bit of violence. Biddy, really foundation, one of the cornerstones of the black community in LA in the 19th century, and then co-founder of one of the enduring institutions, the first AME church, which I think probably most of us know about it, but has been very active in regard to political activism over the years as well. If a Democratic presidential candidate is coming to LA and wants to speak to the Black community, they're as likely to speak from the pulpit at the first AME church as anywhere. And then you get Paul Williams, who, as I said, he was a great Black architect. He got 3,000 buildings built because he was a great architect. And he very quietly defined a lot of things that we think of as LA style today. The Beverly Hills Hotel, the themed restaurant, Saks, Perinos, etc. And then you get Jackie Robinson, who was really a trailblazer wherever he went, leading to integration. Well, there were other sports that had been integrated prior to that, but they were, basketball and football were not a really big deal at that point. The integration with the Dodgers was sort of the decisive act there, and within a decade, you had people like Bill Russell and Jim Brown, and people were used to seeing Black athletes in all sports. And then you have Mack Robinson, who, as I said, my take on it is a little bit different, that he was involved in one of the seminal moments and achievements in regard to U.S. Olympic history. And so these folks are towering figures in Black history and informing the Black community in Pasadena and LA. But also, as I'm pointing out here, and really as I got into this is really sort of my reframing of this, very, very, very important in defining what California and Southern California and what American life is today. And so that is the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to throw it open for questions. And Kathy, how are we doing on time? How are we doing on time? Do we need to get out of here right now? Okay, so if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to mention them. Oh, incidentally, there are a number of people on this team. Initially, we were thinking of doing a bus tour, and that would be going around to various places in Pasadena, not just currently, but the places we saw, but the older Black neighborhoods, for example, on Vernon, et cetera. What we call a then and now kind of tour, where we would have video on the bus, so that you would then be able to see what the neighborhood was like then and going around. So we have a number of people working on that, one of whom is Seth Middleton, who, please stand up, Seth. And also Lake Payne, some of you may know as well, who's out of state today. And what we're trying to do with this series is come up with some stories that may have salience to the community. So, for example, we did this thing last November for Hispanic Heritage Month, and it was sort of focused on white architects who were doing Spanish style in the 1920s. And we had an opportunity to talk at the Latino Heritage Parade with Victor Gordo, the council member who's running for mayor, and Sid Garcia, who's the MC, who's a ABC7, is a reporter, and Cynthia Levo, who is the Dean of Students at PCC. And they gave us input that allowed us to substantially rethink that, and then we ended up doing a story here about 3 weeks later that wasn't just focusing on largely Anglo architects in the 1920s, but all the way from the missions in 1769 to post-World War II immigrant Hispanic architects like Cesar Pelli, who did the Pacific Design Center, Ricardo Legarreta did Pershing Square, Rafael Maneo, who did the cathedral, so you could see 200 years there of the Spanish influence. That was really good, and Cynthia Levo was interested in bringing that story into PCC. And if these stories are of interest, I mean, my hope would be that 5 years from now we would have some people closer to the community who were like 25 or something, who are telling the stories in their own ways. So, number one, we're open for questions. Number two, if you have any comments or suggestions talk to either Seth or myself afterwards. Number three, this is built on some work that, as I said, Stephen McCall with LA Conservancy really got me started on this road. It's built on some work that was done by LA Conservancy and Pasadena Heritage in regard to Biddy Mason and Paul R. Williams. However, and this is a brilliant concept on Kathy's part to have these three talks. However, any shortcomings in this should not be attributed to Pasadena Heritage or LA Conservancy, but please see me.